Hello, I'm Gwen Hill from Pine Ridge Baptist Church Sunday School Department, Ladies Class, and we're studying Exodus. We're on chapter 22. Would like to give you just a little bit of background before we start. This is Moses and God are on top of Mount Sinai. At the base of the mountain is 2.5 million former slaves, Israelite people primarily, that God wants to turn into a nation. It's fulfillment of a promise that he made to Abraham. This is when you take a group that has primarily been a big family, big extended family, and people that have not been able to govern themselves, and you want to make them into a nation. They have to have some form of order. They have to have rules, regulations. Everybody can't do what everybody feels is the right thing to do, or you have chaos. So God has given them the precepts. He's giving them the beginnings. He's giving them what they need to begin to be a nation. And he has started out with his voice booming from the top of Mount Sinai for all the people to hear, and giving them the 10 Commandments. The people, being much like me, a very sinful person, and hearing the audible voice of God was very convicting, and it scared them. It scared them real bad. They thought they were going to die if they had to continue with that. So they went to Moses and asked Moses, or told Moses, please have God speak to you, and then you speak to us. We can handle it that way, but we can't handle listening to God speak. So Moses and God came to an agreement, and God invited Moses to come to the mountain, where he's sharing with Moses how he is to teach the judges that he has. Remember Jethro? Jethro helped him set up 70 judges, so that they get all of the small problems and the medium problems, and only the big ones come to Moses. God's going to give him some directions for that. If you were a lawyer, he would be giving you case studies. All right, that's what this is. So we're going to start today where we left off last week. We're going to start with verse 5 in chapter 22. This is a New International Version, if it reads a little differently from the translation that you're reading along with. If a man causes a field or a vineyard to be grazed and lets loose his animal and it feeds in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard. If a fire breaks out and catches in the thorns, so that that stacked grain, standing grain in the field is consumed, he who kindled the fire shall surely make restitution. If a man delivers to his neighbor money or articles to keep, and it is stolen out of the man's house, if the thief is found, he, the thief, shall pay double. If the thief is not found, then the master of the house shall be brought to the judges to see whether he has put his hand into his neighbor's goods. Let's unpack those few sentences. It's talking about a vineyard being grazed. If this is, you've got to remember too, this was a culture of agriculture. They were livestock people. They planted wheat and vineyards and those kind of things, and that's the kind of culture. That's how they made their living. That's how they made their survival in a very tough land. And so if I had a vineyard or I had a field, and my neighbor's animals, livestock, got in there and they ate it all, or they trampled it all down, that was a really bad thing for me. That's the way I fed my family. And so the person who owned the livestock, God is saying that if he let loose his animals and it fed in another man's field, how I make restitution for that, how I handle that is I go to the person who was injured and I say, all right, bring your stock over to feed in my field, graze in my field, or you can have the best of my vineyard. That's how you made restitution. the number 6, when it's talking about if a fire breaks out and catches in the thorns, are you aware that there was a lot of wild thorns in that area? They would gather those thorns up and they would make kind of like a hedgerow around the fields to protect those fields from animals wandering in, wild animals wandering in. Those hedgerows would be so thick that it would protect. And if I was out in our culture, where I live, they get out in the fall and they burn leaves. Or in the spring, they burn off a piece of ground that they're going to plant their garden in. If I was out burning and I let the fire get away, or if I intentionally set a fire, and that fire got started so much that it even got through the thorns, burned the thorns to get to where the grain was stored, where the grain was kept, that could be a person's whole year's food supply. So, if I'm the guilty person who allowed my fire to get out of hand, I've got to pay him back for that. I've got to replace that. If a man delivers his neighbor money or articles to keep, in our culture, you're going on vacation and you want somebody to keep something that's valuable of yours. You come back home and someone tells you, well, I'm sorry, but that's no longer here. It was stolen. In that day and time, they didn't have the police, so they could say, show me the police report where you reported it. They had the choice of accepting what he said for truth, investigating and finding out that maybe it wasn't the truth. So God said, if the thief is found, then the thief has to pay double what he stole. But if the thief wasn't found, then the two parties have to go before one of the judges and let the judge decide whether or not the man that was holding the articles actually did his best to take care of them, or if he pocketed them for himself to make money. Responsibility was really stressed in this society. Everybody had to be aware of their responsibilities, as in our culture. In verse 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 9. For any kind of trespass, whether it concerns an ox, a donkey, a sheep, or clothing, or any kind of lost item which another claims to be his, the cause of both parties shall come before the judges, and whomever the judges condemn shall pay double to his neighbor. Do you know the old adage that I always heard when I was growing up? Losers, weepers, finders, keepers. Not here. This is losers, weepers. But if I find it, it's yours. It goes back to you because it originally was your property, and it still is your property. So if we both claim it, then we need to go before a judge and let him look at the evidence. But if the evidence showed that it belonged to me to start with, that I didn't sell it to you, give it to you, but I lost it and you found it, then thank you for finding it, but it comes back to me. And if you had me go to court because you wanted to keep it, then you've got to pay me double. Do you see a lot of things going on here that if I'm not an honest person, that it's going to be very expensive for me? Be a lot cheaper to live my life being careful of my neighbor and being honest. It's kind of what God's wanting them to be, isn't it? If a man delivers to his neighbor an ox, a donkey, a sheep, or any animal to keep, and it dies, or is hurt, or driven away, but nobody saw it, then an oath of the Lord shall be between the two of them, that he has not put his hand to his neighbor's goods, and the owner shall accept it, and he shall not make it good. In good faith, you left your donkey with me. I left the donkey in its corral when I went to bed last night, and the donkey was healthy. It was no problem whatsoever, and the gate was secured. But I get up the next morning and the gate is open and the donkey is gone, then that's what I need to tell you. That was out of my control. I did everything I could to care for your item. But you and I would go before the judge, and each of us would tell our story. And if the judge accepts that, then that's it. But if in fact you find out that I stole that donkey and I gave it to my brother to hide on his field, well, when that happens, then I've got to give you back the donkey and make restitution. If I tell you that that donkey, or if I find out that the donkey died in my care, most owners back then, even in the Wild West in our own American history, when you had cattle and horses, the ranchers branded them. Well, back in that time, they would do something like put a notch in the ear, make a slit in the ear, or something like that, and that's how they identified one person's property from another. Said, so even if it was torn to pieces by a beast, then he shall bring in evidence, and it shall be made good, not make good what is torn. So he says that was an animal that got your animal, and there's nothing, I couldn't have prevented it in any way. So to prove that the animal had been killed, I would bring in an ear. I'd cut an ear off the carcass and bring it in. In our day and time, we would talk about something that we left with our neighbors while we went on vacation. That's just my example. Maybe you left the key to your house to someone and said, would you please go in and water my plants every other day? And they were very conscientious about doing that. But on the day that they didn't go, someone broke into that house. Well, it wasn't my neighbor's fault. They locked the door back when they left, and I would have no responsibility for that. But if they found out that I had been careless with the key, if I had knowingly lent the key to someone else to go in the house, I would be responsible then. Surety, a person take responsibility from another. And 14, and if a man borrows anything from his neighbor and it becomes injured or dies, the owner of it not being with him, then he should surely make it good. Okay, I go over and borrow a hoe. Oh, let's go a ladder. I borrow a ladder. The ladder is sound. It's a good operation. But while I've got it, I allow that ladder to be broke. Maybe I gave the example in my Sunday school class of maybe I ran my truck over it and broke it. I've got to replace the ladder. Okay, that's what that means. Then in verse 15 it says, but if the owner is with it, he shall not make it good. If it was hired, it came for its hire. If my neighbor came with the ladder, it's partly his responsibility because he's there to stop me if I'm doing something dangerous with the ladder. If I'm endangering the ladder, he sees me go to get my truck to back up and he sees the ladder laying on the ground near the tires. He should throw up a hand and say, hey, wait a minute. And if he doesn't do that, then part of the damage is his own fault because he was there and he should have been alert and watchful. If I came to my neighbor and I said, would you let me borrow your ladder? And he said, no, but I'll rent it to you. And I give him money to rent the ladder. And in the course of using the ladder is broken or run over with my truck, then I can say, I'm so sorry, but this is what's happened. And when you rent items out, you've got to expect things to happen to them every once in a while. So that's just the way it is. In verse 16, 17, 18, 19, we're talking about promiscuity, especially in 16, 17. God wants them to understand just how harmful to the family unit this is, how premarital sex is not good, how the importance of the family unit. Let's read 16. If a man entices a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall surely pay the bride price for her to be his wife. We're talking about the culture where a woman is primarily under the care of her father till she marries, and then she's under the care of her husband. You had very few ladies who chose to be on their own by themselves. You have widows and you have the unmarried, but the unmarried are still under the auspices of their father if he's alive. So if a man knows this young lady is a virgin and he sweet talks her, he entices her to have a relationship with him, then he is also declaring that he wants to marry her, whether that was his intent or not. The deed said that. So he had to pay a bride's price. The bride's price was usually in this day and time about 30 shekels. You've got to think this was a family unit and everybody has a part to play for the survival of the unit. No one just lackadaisical played their life away. Even children at a young age had chores to do. Little boys were taught to be shepherds even when they were 7 and 8 years old. And if you took the lady out, if you took the young girl out of her family unit, they lost a worker. So this helps them. The bride price helps them to get another worker or compensate them for the loss of her work. Okay, so he has enticed her to marry him, to go to bed with him, and as a result, he is now committed to marry her. He goes to the father, and the father says, "No way, Jose." In 17 it says, "If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money according to the bride price of virgins." Daddy looks at him and he says, "There ain't no way, Jose. You're bad news. And I would rather have my daughter no longer a virgin and still under my care as to trust you with her. I don't trust you with her. But you will still pay me the bride's price." Because you see, it's going to be very difficult now for this young lady to get married in this culture. All right, now we go to 18. "You shall not permit a sorceress to live. Whoever lies with an animal shall surely be put to death." In verse 18, witchcraft is not anything to be amused about. It is not anything for you to think lightly about. Witchcraft primarily is the worship of Satan. God is saying, I will not have that in you. This nation is to be my nation. You are to be my people. You are to worship me only. You are to be a kingdom of priests, a nation of priests. There's no room for witchcraft here. There's no room for sorcery here. And as harsh as it seems to us in our culture, God said, get it out. Get it out. It's just like a bad apple in the bushel. Yes, it will ruin the rest. He does not tolerate this and will not have it. This is for the Israeli culture. He was grooming them to be a kingdom of priests. It does not give us in our day the right to go hunt witches and put them to death. That is not what he's saying. He's saying, I want a kingdom of priests. There's no room here for that, and he will not tolerate it. He still does not tolerate worship of Satan. You can't have both. And the penalty was death. And it was not a penalty that they didn't know about, that just came about. This is something they've known about for years, and decisions have been made. Be careful when you treat witchcraft lightly. You're dealing with the supernatural, and God says He's not having any part of it. Not any part of witchcraft. He says, this is sexual deviancy in 19, when he talks about whoever lies with an animal shall surely be put to death. He is also telling them, the peoples around you. There was a group that was bordering around where the Israelites were. That was part of their religion, was sex with animals. You know, they had the temple priests and the temple prostitutes that Paul was after, you know, to try to get that to stop. But God is talking on this mountaintop to Moses, and He says, I will not tolerate that. That type of deviant behavior has no place in my people, and I want it out, and I will not tolerate it. Verses 20 through 24, I've entitled this section, No Idols. Remember your past, and then protect the defenseless. In verse 20, he who sacrifices to any god except the Lord only, he shall be utterly destroyed. God said, only me. I'm the one that brought you out of Egypt. I'm the one that's going to be your God and enable you to become a nation. I'm the one that made the promises to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and you're mine. And you are not to sacrifice to any god except me. And He meant it, and He still does. Verse 21, you shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Remember how it felt? You know, sometimes we are very judgmental. We forget how we felt. Before you judge somebody, are you so perfect? Most of us aren't. No. We make enough mistakes in our own lives that we need to be very, very careful about judging someone else or mistreating someone else because we believe we know their methods, their motivation. A lot of times we don't. I know what kind of things I've done in my life that was displeasing to the Lord. And I can't throw stones at anybody. Our God is a magnificent, wonderful God. And He loves all. And He is telling us, don't you mistreat the stranger. Remember who you are. The person that you don't understand, don't mistreat them. Don't mistreat them. Verse 22, you shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If you afflict them in any way, and they cry to me, I will surely hear their cry. And my wrath will become hot, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives will be the widows, and your children the fatherless. Can you hear the passion of God about taking care of the defenseless? He 100% says, I am listening. And if they cry out to me, I will avenge them. He said, we were talking in class this morning, I said, a lot of women, myself included, when you go to trade cars, you think they really took advantage of me because I'm a woman, or you're afraid they're going to because you're a woman. And every lady in the class nodded her head yes. Everyone. When we intentionally take advantage of widows and orphans, especially in this day and time, they were so dependent upon the husband, dependent upon the father. They were destitute without that. God says you've got to take care of each other. You're going to be a loving family, a loving nation, a caring nation, a nation of priests to take care of everyone. And he says, and if you don't do this, if you don't take care of those widows, if you don't take care of those children, then I will take revenge. And that revenge will be your wife will find herself a widow, and your children will find themselves fatherless. Now we're going in talking about loans and money. Remember, all this talking that God and Moses is doing is being like a case study, so that when those judges are presented with problems, they have an example to go to. If you go into a lawyer's office or a judge's office, got big long lines of books where they can look up case law, where this kind of a situation occurred 2 or 3 years ago, and this judge saw it this way, this judge saw it the other way. It was presented in this manner. This is what God's given them, something they can look back on and say, well, now God said in this situation that we should do this, that, or the other. Verse 25, if you lend money to any of my people who are poor among you, you shall not be like a money lender to him. You shall not charge him interest. There were a lot of poor people in Israel. Poor to the point to where they were having difficulty surviving. And maybe they would go to someone who was known to have money and a history of lending, and they would borrow money. Notice this is Jew lending to Jew. Okay? And he says in 26, if you ever take your neighbor's garment as a pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. I gave the example, I need to borrow $5 to get a gallon of milk for my family. And I really need it, and there's no other way I could come up with the $5. And the money lender hands me the money and says, oh, leave your coat with me. That way I know that when you get your $5 back, you're going to pay me back, and I'll give you your coat back. God said, that's okay for you to do that. But in this day and time, they didn't have multiple sets of clothing. A lot of the poor people only had one set of clothing. And they used it for multiple purposes. Their cloak, a lot of times, was the only blanket they had to sleep under in cold nights. So God said, you're not going to do that. You're not going to keep that cloak from him. So if you took that as collateral, at bedtime you had to bring it back to me. So I don't know in the morning if I took it back to you or if you came and got it, but that night I had to have it back until I paid it out. You would keep doing it. Pretty soon you'd say collateral wasn't worth it, wouldn't you? 27, for that's his only covering, it is his garment for his skin. What will he sleep in? And it will be that when he cries to me, I will hear, for I am gracious. God said, don't make me come down there. He said, if he cries out that you're treating him unjustly, I will hear, and I will know. Verse 28, you shall not revile God, nor curse the ruler of your people. God is worthy of worship. He is worthy of us calling on his name in holiness and in righteousness, but not taking it in vain. And he says, remember who I am. In verse 29, you shall not delay to offer the first of your ripe produce and your juices, the firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. He says, in a place, in an area where so many do human sacrifices, that is not what I'm asking of you. I'm going to ask for sacrifices. It's going to be sacrifices of your time, sacrifices of your talent, sacrifices of your loyalty and your worship. He said, when it comes to your grains, I want the first harvest, a portion of the first harvest to be given to me as a sacrifice. I want you in your vineyards, the first run of your wine belongs to me. Your sons, your firstborn son, is to be given into my service, not as a sacrifice, a body sacrifice, but as a service sacrifice. The 70 that are at the bottom of the mountain that are helping Aaron take care of the 2.5 million people down there are more than likely firstborn sons. Okay? God said they're mine, and they're the leaders down there. It is thought from the commentators that I read that this was in response to the firstborn being servants, being the priest, until the Levites were called. And that's coming up, but it's not now. Okay? Right now, it's the firstborn sons that are going to be acting as the priest. A little later, you'll see that narrows down to just the whole tribe of Levi. Verse 30 says, likewise you shall do with your oxen and your sheep, and it shall be with his mother 7 days, and on the 8th day you shall give it to me. He says, even the firstborn of your livestock, that is to be given to me, to my services, either the service of it or the sacrifice of it. And then verse 31, and you shall be holy men to me. You shall not eat meat torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. He says, you're going to be holy men to me. This whole 2.5 million people that he has at the base of the mountain, he has plans to making this a holy nation, a nation that he can use to spread out and be an example for the whole world to come to him. And he said, that's what I intend for you to be. You're going to be holy. You're going to listen to my word, obey my word, and have a relationship with me. One of the things you're going to refrain from doing, he said, is you're not going to eat meat torn by beasts in the fields. It's not good for you. You're going to throw it to the dogs. Can you think of a prophet that totally disregarded this section of law? What about Samson and Delilah? Do you remember the story about Samson? He was walking along the road and he saw a dead lion. He should not have approached it because it was a dead carcass and it would have made him defiled, but he did. And because he was curious, he saw that there was a honeycomb. Bees had, where the animal had been ripped open, they had built a honeycomb inside. And he reached in and got the honey out to eat. God said, here, he said, you shouldn't do things like that. Okay, this ends chapter 22. Next time we meet, we'll talk about chapter 23. Hope you have a real good day.